It's 6 o'clock in the morning on September 8th, 1900, and Galveston, Texas is waking up to a strange sky. On the Strand, the city's main commercial boulevard, merchants are unlocking iron shutters and arranging goods in windows. The smell of salt water and coffee drifts through the morning air. Down at the docks, fishermen check their lines. A group of children races barefoot along the beach, laughing at the waves, which are bigger than usual today, foamy and dark, rolling in from the Gulf with an unusual urgency. A telegraph operator at the Weather Bureau office on 23rd Street reads the morning dispatch and frowns. There are reports of a tropical storm somewhere in the Gulf. Nothing confirmed yet. Nothing to panic about. By nightfall, over 8,000 people in this city will be dead. Galveston in 1900 was not just a city, it was a statement. The wealthiest city per capita in the entire United States, a jewel on the Texas coast, built on a narrow barrier island barely 9 feet above sea level at its highest point. Its streets were lined with Victorian mansions. Its port handled more cotton than any other in the country. It had electric streetcars, a telephone system, and a grand opera house. Galveston looked at the Gulf of Mexico every morning and saw opportunity, not danger. That was the first mistake. Because the Gulf of Mexico, in the late summer of 1900, was hiding something. A storm so vast and so powerful that no one in the city could fully imagine it. A storm that had already crossed Cuba, already churned through the Caribbean, already sent warnings ahead of itself that were heard, noted, and largely dismissed. To understand what happened to Galveston on September 8, 1900, you first need to understand what kind of city it was, and why it was so completely unprepared to survive what was coming. Galveston didn't become the crown jewel of Texas by accident. It was built by ambition, sustained by commerce, and protected, its residents believed, by geography itself. The island sat just off the Texas coast, a narrow strip of land 27 miles long and no more than 3 miles wide, separated from the mainland by a shallow bay. The Gulf of Mexico stretched to the south, Galveston Bay to the north. The city occupied almost every inch of available ground, built right to the water's edge on both sides. By 1900, it was home to 37,000 people. It had more millionaires per square mile than almost anywhere else in the country. The Strand, its commercial heart, was called the Wall Street of the Southwest. Cotton brokers, banking houses, and shipping companies operated from ornate Victorian storefronts that would not have looked out of place in New York or London. The wharves stretched for miles, loading and unloading cargo from ships bound for Europe, South America, and every port on the American coast. It was, by every measure, a city at the height of its power. And it sat at its absolute highest point, 9 feet above sea level. This was not a secret. Everyone in Galveston knew their island was flat and low. They simply didn't believe it mattered. The Gulf had thrown storms at Galveston before, in 1867, in 1875, in 1886. And the city had survived everyone, not unscathed, but upright, standing. Galveston had a saying, informal but widely held. The island's gradual offshore slope would break apart any major storm before it could hit with full force. The shallow Gulf bottom, the theory went, would rob a hurricane of its power before it reached the shore. It was a comforting theory. It was also completely wrong. The man who knew it was wrong was Isaac Klein. He was the chief meteorologist for the United States Weather Bureau in Galveston, a trained scientist who had spent years studying the Texas coast. And in 1891, 9 years before the storm, Klein had written a formal report arguing that Galveston was dangerously exposed. that a major hurricane striking the island directly could produce a storm surge capable of overwhelming the entire city, that without a seawall, a protective barrier of some kind, Galveston was a disaster waiting to happen. The report was read, filed, and forgotten. What happened next reveals something essential about how human beings respond to warnings they find inconvenient. Klein himself, under pressure from city boosters who worried about damaging Galveston's reputation as an investment destination, eventually softened his own position. By 1900, he had publicly reversed course, writing that the idea of a catastrophic hurricane striking Galveston was, in his words, an absurd delusion. The city's natural geography, he now argued, made it essentially safe. He would spend the rest of his life regretting those words. The storm that would destroy Galveston was born, as most Atlantic hurricanes are, off the west coast of Africa. By late August 1900, it had crossed the Atlantic, moved through the Caribbean, and passed over Cuba, where it killed dozens and left a trail of destruction. American weather observers in Cuba tracked it carefully and sent urgent telegrams to Washington, warning that the storm was intensifying and heading toward the Gulf of Mexico. Washington received the warnings and then made a decision that would have catastrophic consequences. The United States Weather Bureau, operating under a chief who distrusted Cuban meteorologists and had prohibited his staff from issuing hurricane warnings without direct authorization from Washington, downplayed the storm's threat. When Cuban forecasters predicted the hurricane would curve into the Gulf and strike the Texas coast, their American counterparts publicly disagreed. The storm, Washington insisted, would curve north and make landfall in Florida or the Carolinas. It would not. By September 7th, the storm was in the Gulf of Mexico and growing. Ships that encountered it reported seas unlike anything their crews had ever seen. One vessel recorded winds so violent that its instruments failed. Another lost 2 men overboard before it could turn away. The storm was enormous, organized, and moving northwest at speed, directly toward Galveston. That evening, Isaac Klein noticed the surf. Walking along the beach, he observed waves rolling in far higher and more powerful than any storm on the horizon could explain. The sky to the south had a greenish cast. The barometer in his office had been dropping steadily for hours. He sent a telegram to Washington. Conditions in Galveston suggest the possibility of a severe storm. The reply instructed him to raise storm warning flags. The flags went up on the morning of September 8th. Some residents saw them and began moving valuables to upper floors. A few families loaded wagons and headed for the mainland bridge. But most of Galveston went about its Saturday routine. Crowds actually gathered on the beach that morning to watch the impressive surf. Families brought children to see the waves. It was a spectacle, a curiosity. No one told them to leave. No evacuation was ordered. There was no plan for evacuating 37,000 people from a barrier island with a single bridge to the mainland. No one had ever written one. By noon, the water was already rising. The water didn't arrive all at once. It crept. By early afternoon on September 8th, the Gulf had already crossed the beach and was moving into the streets closest to the shore. Residents who lived near the waterfront watched from their porches as the water rose inch by inch, then foot by foot. It didn't look like a flood. It looked like a very high tide. Inconvenient, manageable. The kind of thing Galveston dealt with every few years. People made adjustments. They moved furniture to upper floors. They rolled up rugs. Some waded through ankle-deep water to check on neighbors. Children splashed in the streets and laughed. Nobody was laughing by 3 o'clock in the afternoon. The storm surge, a wall of water pushed ahead of the hurricane by sustained winds now exceeding 100 miles per hour, had been building in the Gulf for hours, invisible beneath the surface, displacing millions of tons of water toward the shallow Texas coast. When it hit Galveston, it didn't announce itself. It simply arrived. Water that had been at knee level was suddenly at waist level, then chest level, then above the heads of people who had been standing in their own living rooms minutes before. The wind arrived with it. Not a strong wind, not even a dangerous wind by the standards of what was coming. This was the outer edge, the first breath of something that was still miles offshore and already dismantling a city. Isaac Klein spent the early afternoon riding on horseback through the flooding streets, shouting at residents to move to higher ground, to leave their homes, to get to the center of the island where the elevation, such as it was, offered a few extra feet of margin. Some listened, most didn't. The water was rising fast, but they still couldn't believe, not really believe, not in their bones, that their city was about to cease to exist. By 4 o'clock in the afternoon, the bridge to the mainland was underwater. Galveston was now an island within an island. 37,000 people with nowhere to go. The wind shifted at approximately 5:30 in the evening, and when it did, everything changed. The hurricane made landfall just southwest of Galveston, with sustained winds estimated at 145 miles per hour. A Category 4 storm by modern classification, though that scale didn't exist yet. The storm surge that accompanied it reached between 15 and 20 feet above normal tide levels. In a city whose highest point was 9 feet above sea level, this was not a flood. It was a submersion. The sound that survivors described first was not the wind. It was the houses, frame houses, and Galveston had thousands of them. Beautiful Victorian structures built of wood, elevated on piers, designed to breathe in the Gulf heat, began to come apart. Not slowly, not in pieces, they collapsed in seconds, reduced to thousands of individual boards and beams and nails that the storm surge immediately swept up and carried forward. Each house that fell became a weapon. The debris field moved with the water, a grinding wall of wreckage that hit the next house, and the next, and the next. Survivors described it as a battering ram. A house would shudder, the walls would bow inward, and then the entire structure would simply dissolve, as if it had been made of paper. The people inside had, at most, seconds to react. Clara Barton was not in Galveston that night, but the survivors who spoke to her weeks later described the same thing repeatedly. The moment the house began to move, not collapse, move. The storm surge lifted entire structures off their foundations and carried them intact for a few terrifying seconds before they broke apart in the current. Louisa Rowling was 28 years old. She was sheltering with her husband and 3 children in their 2-story home near the center of the island when the ground floor flooded completely. They climbed to the 2nd floor, then the roof. When the roof began to tear away, her husband grabbed their youngest child and told Louisa to hold on to anything she could find. In the darkness and the screaming wind, she grabbed a section of wooden roofing and held it as the storm surge swept her off the house entirely. She rode that piece of lumber through the flooded streets for hours, unable to see, unable to hear anything over the wind, not knowing where her husband or children were. She survived. Her husband and all 3 children did not. Stories like hers were not the exception that night. They were the rule. The hurricane's eye passed just south of the island sometime around 8 o'clock in the evening. For a brief, disorienting period, the wind dropped. The rain lessened. Survivors who had been clinging to debris, to rooftops, to the upper floors of the few brick structures still standing, looked out into a darkness filled with the sounds of destruction. Wood cracking, water rushing, people calling out names in the dark. Some thought it was over. Some even climbed down from their refuge. Then the back wall of the storm hit. If anything, the second half was worse. The wind reversed direction, now blowing from the north, pushing the accumulated storm surge back across the island from the bayside. Water that had partially drained now surged back. Debris that had piled against the southern structures reversed and swept northward. People who had survived the first half of the storm were caught in the second. By midnight, the wind had begun to diminish. By 2 o'clock in the morning, it was down to a strong gale. By dawn on September 9th, it was, for all practical purposes, over. The survivors emerged into a landscape they did not recognize. The southern third of Galveston, the neighborhoods closest to the Gulf. Blocks and blocks of homes, churches, businesses, an orphanage, a hospital, was simply gone. Not damaged, not flooded, gone. Where houses had stood, there was now open sky and a layer of debris 6 feet deep in some places, stretching for miles. The wreckage contained everything a city had been made of. Furniture, clothing, toys, ledger books from offices, family photographs, the contents of pharmacies and grocery stores, and the bodies of the dead. Thousands of bodies. They were everywhere. In the debris, in the bay, washed up on the beach, tangled in the wreckage of houses. A survivor named Richard Spillane walked through the city the morning after and wrote in his journal, "I walked for 2 hours and could not find a single block that had not claimed at least one life. In some places, the dead were piled 3 and 4 deep." The city's official death toll was eventually set at 8,000. Many historians believe the true number was higher. Possibly 10,000, possibly 12,000. The uncertainty exists because entire families were wiped out completely, leaving no one to report them missing. Entire neighborhoods vanished so completely that no record survived of who had lived there. In a single night, between 1/5 and 1/3 of Galveston's entire population had been killed. It remains, to this day, the deadliest natural disaster in American history. No hurricane, no earthquake, no flood before or since has killed more people on American soil in a single event. And it had been, in some essential way, preventable. Not the storm. No one could have stopped the storm. But the death toll, that extraordinary, staggering number, was the product of geography exploited without caution, warnings dismissed without consequence, and a city that had looked at the Gulf of Mexico for 50 years and decided, without evidence, that it was safe. The morning of September 9th, 1900, smelled like death. Survivors who emerged from the wreckage described the same thing. An air so thick with salt, mud, and decay that breathing felt like swallowing the storm itself. The sun came out. The Gulf was calm. The sky was a brilliant, indifferent blue, and stretching in every direction, as far as anyone could see, was the evidence of what that calm sky had permitted to happen. The first task was the dead. There were too many to bury. That was the brutal, immediate reality that Galveston's surviving leadership faced on the morning of September 9th. The city had lost somewhere between 8,000 and 12,000 people in a single night. The September heat was already accelerating decomposition. Within 48 hours, the risk of epidemic disease, typhoid, cholera, dysentery, would become as serious a threat as the storm itself had been. The decision was made to load the bodies onto barges and bury them at sea. Hundreds of the dead were carried to waiting vessels, weighted and committed to the Gulf. It was not a dignified end. Many families would never have a grave to visit, never have a confirmed location where someone they loved had been laid to rest. The gulf that had killed them simply took them back. But even that solution failed. Within days, the currents returned the bodies to shore. The sea would not keep them. There was no alternative. Galveston built funeral pyres. For weeks, fires burned across the debris fields as the city cremated its dead by the hundreds. The smoke was visible for miles. Survivors worked alongside strangers, carrying bodies to the flames, trying not to look at faces, trying not to recognize anyone. Clara Barton arrived with the Red Cross within days. She was 78 years old. She had nursed soldiers through the Civil War. She had organized disaster relief across 2 continents. When she saw Galveston, she said it was the worst thing she had ever witnessed. The Red Cross would remain for months, distributing supplies, organizing shelter, helping families find each other in the chaos of displacement. Donations arrived from across the country, from around the world. The people of Mexico sent aid. European governments contributed. American cities held fundraisers. The generosity was real and immediate, and not nearly enough. Because the scale of what needed to be rebuilt was almost incomprehensible. 1,200 city blocks had been damaged or destroyed. 3,600 homes were gone. The port, the economic engine of the entire region, was crippled. The railway bridge to the mainland had been swept away. The water supply was contaminated. The city had no functioning sewage system, no reliable electricity, no operational hospitals. Galveston had been, 1 week earlier, the wealthiest city per capita in the United States. Now it was a disaster zone that smelled of smoke and salt and loss. And here is where the story of Galveston diverges from so many other stories of American disaster. Galveston chose to fight back, not just to rebuild, to transform. Within weeks of the storm, city leaders convened an emergency commission. Engineers were consulted. Scientists were brought in. The question on the table was not whether to rebuild Galveston. That was never seriously in doubt. But how to rebuild it in a way that ensured this could never happen again. The answer came in 2 extraordinary acts of engineering. The first was the seawall. Construction began in 1902. The plan called for a massive concrete barrier, 17 feet high and 16 feet wide at its base, running along the entire Gulf-facing shore of the island. It would be built to absorb the force of any storm surge the Gulf could generate. The first section, 3 miles long, was completed in 1904. Over the following decades, it was extended again and again until it stretched 10 miles along the coast. The seawall still stands today. It is not a modest structure. Walking beside it, you understand immediately that it was built by people who had seen what the Gulf could do and decided, collectively and permanently, that it would never do it again. But the seawall alone was not enough. A 17-foot barrier protecting a city that sat, in places, barely 2 feet above sea level would simply trap floodwater on the island rather than stopping it. So Galveston undertook something even more audacious. They raised the city. Working over more than a decade, engineers pumped millions of cubic yards of sand dredged from the Gulf floor beneath the existing streets and structures of Galveston. Buildings were lifted. Some of them raised more than 11 feet, while the grade beneath them was elevated. The project required jacking up over 2,000 structures, including a 3,000-ton cathedral that was raised on 700 screw jacks simultaneously, its pipe organ still intact, without cracking a single wall. It was one of the most ambitious civil engineering projects in American history, and it worked. When a powerful hurricane struck Galveston again in 1915, the seawall held. The city flooded but did not drown. The death toll was 11, compared to the thousands who had died in 1900. The engineering that had seemed almost impossibly ambitious had within 15 years already saved thousands of lives. But numbers don't fully capture what was lost on September 8, 1900. Galveston never fully recovered its position. In the years after the storm, Houston, safer, inland, connected by a newly dredged ship channel, rose to become the dominant city of Texas. The wealth, the commerce, the population growth that Galveston had expected to define its future flowed instead to its mainland rival. Galveston today is a city of 50,000 people, a historic city, a tourist destination, a place of genuine beauty. But it is not the city it was going to be before the storm. That Galveston, the Wall Street of the Southwest, the jewel of the Texas coast, the city that was going to rival New Orleans and New York, died on the night of September 8, 1900, along with the 8,000 people who never saw the morning of September 9th. What the storm could not kill was the will to survive. The seawall that lines Galveston's coast today is not just an engineering structure. It is a monument, a declaration, cast in concrete and steel, that a city looked at the worst thing that had ever happened to it and decided to answer with something permanent. Every year, the Gulf pushes its waves against that wall. Every year, the wall holds. But it should not have taken 8,000 deaths to build it. The warnings existed. The vulnerability was known. The geography was not a secret. What was missing was the will to act before the disaster, rather than after it. What was missing was the simple, costly, inconvenient decision to take the threat seriously while there was still time. Galveston took that lesson and built it into the landscape. It raised its streets. It armored its shore. It wrote the cost of inaction into concrete 17 feet high, so that no future generation could claim they hadn't been warned. The question that Galveston's story leaves behind is not whether we can protect ourselves from what the natural world sends our way. The how the question is whether we'll choose to, before the storm arrives.